A house, once associated with death, is now being quietly listed for rent. 20 tons of water evaporated while it sat vacant, and now with just a single click on a virtual house tour, the floor itself seems to be telling a story no one wanted heard. The apartment stands in silence, sealed behind locked doors and unoccupied hallways. It is an ordinary unit by design. Neutral walls, standard windows. Nothing about its layout suggests notoriety. And yet, for those who know its history, the space feels heavy, as if something unresolved still lingers in the air. This was the place where Yu Manglong met his end. A private residence turned into a permanent question mark. After the incident, the apartment was reportedly left empty. No tenants, no renovation crews, no visible activity. On paper, it was a dormant property, waiting to fade quietly into anonymity. But records posted on the door told a different story. In a span of just 2 months, the unit consumed 20 cubic meters of water. 20 tons. In an apartment where no one lived. At the time, there were only questions. What could require that much water in an empty space? Maintenance was ruled out. No pipes had burst. No long-term leaks were reported. The numbers did not align with any reasonable explanation. And yet, without visual proof, the speculation remained exactly that. Speculation. That changed when the apartment was quietly listed for rent. Netizens discovered the listing on a property rental application, complete with a virtual reality house tour. With a few taps, anyone could now step inside digitally, moving room by room through a space that had once been sealed from public view. It was there, in the simulated stillness of the living room, that something stood out. Near the window, a large section of the floor appeared, warped and discolored. The texture was uneven, the surface dull and swollen. To many viewers, it looked unmistakably like the aftermath of prolonged water exposure. Not a spill, not a brief incident, but soaking, sustained, intentional. As screenshots spread, public opinion shifted almost instantly. Earlier rumors resurfaced with renewed force. The theory that the water had been used to wash away something far more permanent began circulating once again. This time, it was no longer supported only by numbers on a utility bill, but by what people could see with their own eyes. What unsettled many was not only the condition of the floor, but the fact that the apartment was being offered for rent at all. This was not an obscure rumor hidden in niche forums. The case had been widely reported, discussed both domestically and abroad. And yet, despite its reputation as a murder house, the listing remained active, as if the past could simply be priced, packaged, and passed on to the next occupant. Decorative red lanterns soon appeared in the residential complex, signaling preparations for the new year. The contrast was jarring, celebration hanging above a place defined by human tragedy. Some questioned how anyone could still believe in better days while standing on ground that carried such unresolved weight. But the apartment was only the beginning. Because if water was used to erase something, the question is no longer what happened in that room, but who had the power to make it disappear. While the apartment drew public attention through silence and absence, another presence began to emerge from a very different kind of record. Not walls, not floors, but words, screenshots, commands typed without hesitation and circulated without permission. In recent days, a series of leaked chat logs began spreading across social platforms. They were alleged to belong to a man repeatedly named by the public in connection with the Yu Manglong incident. A man who had not appeared once, not before cameras, not before investigators, not even before rumor. He remained entirely unaccounted for. The messages themselves were brief, direct, stripped of pleasantries. In one exchange, an order was issued with unmistakable urgency. A video involving chained legs was to be erased immediately. No explanations, no delays. The method did not matter. Only the result, silence. In another message, dissatisfaction was expressed with cold precision. An audio file had leaked before. This time, failure would not be tolerated. The language carried no trace of negotiation. It assumed obedience as a given. And when subordinates replied, they did so with repetition, deference, and haste. Title after title, a cascade of acknowledgement that revealed more than any insult ever could. To some observers, the tone alone was enough to convince them of the log's authenticity. It was the voice of someone accustomed to command, not persuasion. Someone who did not argue, because argument had never been required. Others remained cautious. Screenshots can be fabricated. Images can be blurred. Any member of a group chat could attempt deception. Yet even skeptics admitted that if the logs were real, they depicted something deeply unsettling. What disturbed the public far more than the content of the messages was the response that followed. Or rather, the lack of one. For months, the same name had been repeated, called out, questioned, demanded, and still there was nothing. No denial, no clarification, no legal threat, no public appearance. In an era where even minor allegations provoke immediate damage control, this silence stood out as abnormal. One commentator offered a blunt explanation during a televised discussion. According to him, the reason was simple. There was protection, not symbolic, not procedural, but structural, a shield that did not operate at ground level. Soon after, comparisons began circulating. Old photographs, facial structures, measurements drawn by artificial intelligence tools. Some claimed mild resemblance, others pushed the numbers higher, too high to ignore. Claims followed that the individual in question bore an uncanny similarity to a close relative of the nation's top leadership. A coincidence, perhaps, or something more. Even names became objects of speculation. A reversal in pronunciation, a phonetic echo. On their own, such details would mean nothing. But layered atop silence, authority, and speed, they began to feel less random. Then, there was the matter of trajectory. According to insider accounts, this individual had reached deputy bureau level before adulthood. By his late 20s, he had already crossed into deputy ministerial rank. Promotions that typically require decades of service appeared to have occurred in a fraction of the time. For many watching, the question was not whether this was impressive. It was whether it was possible at all without extraordinary backing. Against this backdrop, the story of Yu Manglong took on a darker shape. If the apartment suggested erasure and the chat logs suggested control, then the absence of accountability suggested something even more severe. This was not negligence. It was annihilation, not only of a person but of a narrative, the removal of sound, the washing of space, the sealing of consequence. In such a system, power does not need to explain itself. It does not argue its case. It does not rush to defend. It simply waits, confident that time, fear, and distraction will do the work. Yet even the most absolute authority leaves traces, not always in court documents, sometimes in utility records, sometimes in leaked commands, sometimes in the refusal to acknowledge a single name. As public anger grew, another realization settled in. If someone could be implicated so openly and remain untouched, then the system itself was being revealed, not as broken, but as functioning exactly as designed. Yu Manglong, in this light, was no longer just a victim of a tragic incident. He became an example, a warning, a demonstration of what happens when an individual crosses paths with power that answers to nothing visible. And when power reaches that level, death is no longer a tragedy. It becomes a procedure. When institutions fall silent and authority refuses to answer, people often turn elsewhere for meaning. History shows this pattern repeating itself in times of extreme imbalance. When justice cannot be reached through courts, when truth cannot survive press conferences, the human mind begins searching for another framework, one that does not rely on permission. In the aftermath of Yu Manglong's death, this search took on a spiritual form. Among the many voices that emerged was that of a psychic, known publicly as Zhu. Unlike commentators and analysts, she did not speak of evidence or jurisdiction. She spoke of contact. According to her account, Yu Manglong's consciousness no longer existed within the limits of physical suffering. She described his presence as transformed, no longer human in shape or constraint, but condensed into what she called a golden mass of light. To believers, this was not escapism. It was continuation. The message attributed to this encounter did not dwell on personal pain or unfinished business. It carried a warning, not directed at individuals but at systems. According to Zhu, the universe itself had begun to respond. A mechanism older than governments and indifferent to influence was now in motion. She described it through a symbol, a massive black iron chain. This chain, she claimed, had long been buried deep beneath layers of soil and deception. Its purpose was not restraint, but concealment. It bound together those who operated beyond consequence, anchoring them safely below scrutiny. But the message was clear. The chain was no longer secure. It was being pulled upward, slowly, inevitably, dragged through mud and swamp toward the surface. What unsettled listeners was not the imagery alone, but the scope. Zhu stated that when the chain finally emerged, it would not stop at minor figures. Even those at the highest levels of power would be exposed to light. Titles would offer no insulation. Positions would not grant immunity. She gave a time frame, approximately 2 years. From now until that point, she warned, the public would witness events that once seemed unthinkable. Sudden collapses, unexplained removals, names that had been untouchable, becoming unspeakable. Not as rumor, but as consequence. To skeptics, this was mythology, a coping narrative created to soothe collective helplessness. Yet even among those who dismissed the supernatural framing, the timing raised questions. Patterns were already shifting. The entertainment industry was unraveling. Financial empires were destabilizing. Figures once elevated by silence were beginning to disappear from view. Whether coincidence or convergence, the effect was the same. Fear changed sides. In this reframing, Yu Manglong's death no longer appeared as a single act of cruelty. It became a catalyst, the moment that disturbed equilibrium, not because of who he was in status, but because of who he was in character. As stories from his past resurfaced, a different portrait emerged. Accounts of quiet generosity, of attention given to those without leverage. Fans recalled moments of kindness so ordinary they would normally go unnoticed. Helping someone pick up fallen belongings, waiting to assist with luggage, enduring discomfort to avoid disappointing others. Small acts that carried no strategic value. Behind the scenes, former staff spoke of gestures that never reached publicity. Time off granted without request. Financial support offered without acknowledgement. Sponsorships maintained for years without recognition. Even after his death, automated donations continued to move quietly into accounts supporting children he would never meet again. In an industry structured around extraction, Yu Manglong appeared anomalous. He did not hoard goodwill for protection. He distributed it freely, as if unaware of the cost. And perhaps that was the danger. If power operates on silence and compliance, then kindness becomes a form of resistance. It reminds people of standards that systems cannot meet. It exposes contrast. It creates memory. And memory is difficult to erase, no matter how much water is used. This is why some believe the response was not accidental, but absolute. Not intended to punish, but to eliminate disruption. To ensure the machine continued without reflection. Yet machines depend on balance. When imbalance grows too extreme, correction follows. Whether one calls it karma, consequence, or historical inevitability, matters less than its arrival. As the psychic narrative spread, it did not replace investigation. It reframed it. The question was no longer whether the truth would surface, but how. Through exposure, through collapse, or through forces that do not submit to negotiation. If the prophecy is real, then what we are witnessing now is not the end. It is only the beginning. By the time the discussion reached beyond Yu Manglong, a broader pattern had already become impossible to ignore. His death did not stand alone. It sat within an ecosystem that had long normalized exhaustion, silence, and disposability. The entertainment industry, once sold as a dream factory, was revealing itself as something far more mechanical. At its base were tens of thousands of performers struggling for survival. Once vibrant production hubs had thinned into fields of short-form content, assembled quickly and discarded even faster. Long-form films no longer guaranteed attention. Crews dissolved. Sets vanished overnight. For those without status, the work did not disappear. It degraded. Actors spoke of days stretching from dawn into deep night. 5 hours, 10 hours, sometimes 16. Compensation barely sufficient to cover a meal. Respect absent entirely. They were instructed not to question conditions, not to complain, not to remember that they were human. In this environment, the phrase replaceable was not metaphorical. It was operational. The most disturbing cases involved children. Reports surfaced of infants forced to endure artificial rain for extended periods to save time on set. Dolls were rejected as substitutes. Efficiency was prioritized over safety. A baby too young to speak trembled uncontrollably under cold water sprayed from trucks. The mother watched, visibly unwell, but silent. Payment amounted to less than what many spend on a single meal. Responsibility, when questioned, was deflected downward. Parents were blamed. Contracts were cited. The system absolved itself. In another account, a newborn was written into a scene that required placement inside a garbage cart. Filming continued. Laughter followed. The child's father spoke casually about rushing to the next shoot. In these moments, the boundary between performance and cruelty dissolved completely. This was not an aberration. It was consistency. Above this layer sat the illusion of glory. Box office icons, once presented as untouchable, began to falter. Films designed to dominate screens collapsed within days. Audiences withdrew, not out of apathy but fatigue. They were tired of being lectured, tired of slogans replacing substance, tired of being told what to feel while being treated as a means to an end. Statements made in past interviews resurfaced, stripped of context and inflated bravado. Claims once intended to inspire now read as caricature. The public response was not outrage. It was disengagement, the most damaging verdict in any market. As revenue declined, the industry turned inward. Scrutiny intensified. Financial structures that had operated unchecked for years began unraveling. Companies were deregistered without explanation. Accounts went dark. Influential figures disappeared from platforms overnight. Some attributed it to policy shifts. Others suspected tax violations. More cynical observers suggested something simpler. These individuals had outlived their usefulness. Wealth, once flaunted without restraint, became a liability. Socialites, who had documented extravagance down to individual meals, found themselves erased digitally in an instant. Speculation followed. Were they symbols targeted to reset public sentiment, or intermediaries shielding interests too large to be seen? The question lingered, because no answers were offered. Viewed from this angle, Yu Manglong's case felt less isolated and more emblematic. In a system governed by capital velocity and silence, life itself became a consumable. Actors, children, benefactors, each served a purpose until they did not. When value expired, erasure followed. What distinguished Yu Manglong was not his position, but his refusal to conform entirely to this logic. His generosity operated without leverage. His kindness produced no measurable return. He offered time, money, and attention where none were demanded. In a structure optimized for extraction, such behavior introduced friction. Friction slows machines. Perhaps that is why his presence became intolerable. Not because it threatened power directly, but because it reminded others that an alternative existed. That decency had not vanished entirely. That silence was a choice, not a rule. As more stories emerged, a quiet consensus formed. The industry was not collapsing because of one scandal. It was imploding under accumulated neglect. Years of moral erosion had reached a point where concealment no longer functioned. Too many cracks, too many witnesses, too much memory. Systems built on silence eventually encounter a paradox. The more they suppress, the louder the absence becomes. Audiences withdraw. Workers resist invisibly. Power continues performing itself, unaware that the stage is emptying. And, in such an environment, kindness becomes dangerous, because it exposes the cost of cruelty. It creates contrast that no amount of messaging can neutralize. It reminds people what has been lost. In an industry that feeds on silence, kindness becomes the most dangerous crime of all. In the aftermath of everything that surfaced, what remained was not clarity but weight, the kind that does not lift with answers, the kind that settles quietly, forcing reflection long after the noise fades. Yu Manglong's story, when viewed in full, does not resolve into a neat conclusion. There is no official reckoning, no decisive confession, no moment where truth stands alone and undeniable. Instead, there is a trail of absence, an apartment cleaned too thoroughly, commands issued too efficiently, a silence maintained too perfectly. Yet alongside this absence, something else persisted. Memories. They did not arrive as grand gestures or heroic myths. They surfaced in small, unguarded moments. A man stepping out of his car to help someone pick up fallen belongings, waiting an extra minute to assist with luggage, smiling without calculation, giving without record. These fragments accumulated, not because they were promoted, but because they were remembered. Those who spoke about him did not describe ambition. They described attentiveness. He noticed people who were invisible to systems designed to overlook them. He gave time to those who could offer nothing in return. He extended care without expecting insulation from harm. In an environment governed by leverage, such behavior appeared inefficient, even reckless. Perhaps that is why it mattered. When people disappear under pressure, their influence often ends with them. But when someone leaves behind evidence of decency, it becomes difficult to erase. Kindness creates witnesses. It generates continuity. It travels through recollection, rather than records, through gratitude, rather than headlines. This may be why Yu Manglong's presence continued to grow after his death. Not in authority, but in contrast. As industries exposed their indifference, as power retreated into opacity, as wealth became a liability instead of protection, his memory stood apart, defined not by what he controlled, but by what he gave. There is a temptation to frame stories like this as morality tales, to assign roles, to declare villains and martyrs. But reality resists such simplicity. What remains undeniable is the pattern. Systems that rely on silence eventually fracture under their own weight. They do not collapse because of one incident, but because of accumulation. Neglect layered upon neglect. Compromise stacked upon compromise. Yu Manglong's case became visible, not because it was unique, but because it arrived at a moment when concealment was already failing, when too many eyes were open, when too many people recognized the cost of looking away. Whether justice arrives through courts, exposure, or time itself is not something this story can determine. What it can show is that absence does not equal erasure, that silence does not guarantee forgetting, that even in structures designed to suppress consequence, memory remains a form of resistance. The apartment may be rented, the records may be sealed, the names may never be spoken aloud, but the imbalance created by what happened does not simply vanish. It waits. Justice may not arrive when we demand it, but history has shown that no darkness, no matter how absolute, survives forever.